One of Abraham Lincoln's most important addresses was delivered in June of 1848 at the Illinois State House during that state's Republican convention. The occasion for the speech was Lincoln's acceptance of the Republican nomination for the United States Senate. Mr. Lincoln had been working on his address for several weeks, jotting down ideas on scraps of paper and the backs of envelopes, all conveniently tucked away in his signature stovepipe hat. The content of his comments, like his notes, he kept to himself almost to the day of the address. Shortly before the convention, Lincoln ran through the speech before his law partner, William Herndon, and several other prominent friends. Herndon considered Lincoln's comments too radical. Yes, it was morally courageous, but morally courageous did not generally win elections. In his House divided speech, Lincoln was determined to address the logical consequences descending from Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska bill and Chief Justice Taney's Dred Scott decision. He wanted very much to draw a sharp distinction between himself and Stephen Douglas. Lincoln believed that Douglas was a thoroughly unprincipled individual. Douglas had so muddied the waters with a combination of pro and anti-slavery comments, actions, and contradictions. The Republican candidate wanted to make it clear to the voters that if they were committed to arresting the further spread of slavery, the obvious choice was Lincoln and the Republicans. Among the questions Lincoln grappled with during the 1850s was which position on slavery's expansion was the radical position. Certainly, there were radicals among the abolitionists, but the Republican Party was far from an abolitionist party. The heart of the Republican platform was its opposition to slavery's expansion into the territories, while acknowledging the constitutional right of Southerners to hold slaves. Lincoln argued that it was the limitation of slavery, when the opportunity presented itself, that conformed to the nation's history and in no way was radical. Those who insisted on pushing slavery to the Pacific were the radicals. The opening lines of Lincoln's address were as follows: "If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. We are now far into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented." The where we are on the day that Lincoln gave this address was the circumstance in which a slaveholder could legally carry their human property into any territory, and not even Congress had the authority to stop them. The whither we are tending was the possibility that, given the implications of Dred Scott, the next Supreme Court decision could make slavery legal even in the free states. The reference to the 5th year of a policy referred to Douglas's promise that the popular sovereignty built into his Nebraska bill would finally end the agitation over the slavery question, and in that 5 years, the conflict over slavery had only grown more heated and more dangerous. As for the increased agitation attributable to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln stated, "In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." The new year 1854 found slavery excluded from more than half the states by state constitutions and from most of the national territory by congressional prohibition. 4 days later commenced the struggle, which ended in repealing that congressional prohibition. This opened all the national territory to slavery and was the first point gained. For some time, the idea that there was some overarching slave power conspiracy had been gaining traction. Lincoln did not subscribe to that theory, but he did believe that certain ambitious men did do things to advance their own interest and brought the nation to this dangerous position. While the Nebraska bill was passing through Congress, a law case involving the question of a Negro's freedom by reason of his owners having voluntarily taken him first into a free state and then a territory covered by the congressional prohibition, the Negro's name was Dred Scott, which name now designates the decision finally made in the case. First and foremost a lawyer, Lincoln had a penchant in his speeches for building his case, fact by fact. Lincoln took time in his address to review the particulars of the Dred Scott case. The congressional prohibition of which he spoke was the Missouri Compromise line of 3630. Since Stephen Douglas had built his recent political career on popular sovereignty, the Dred Scott decision, which established the absolute right of slaveholders to carry their slave property into the territories, placed him in an awkward position. How could there be popular sovereignty if there was no way settlers could bar slavery? In the speech, Lincoln is arguing that Kansas, Nebraska, and Dred Scott constitute a sort of machinery designed to advance slaveholding interests. The several points of the Dred Scott decision in connection with Senator Douglas's care not policy constitute the piece of machinery in its present state of advancement. The working points of that machinery are, first, that no Negro slave imported as such from Africa and no descendant of such slave can ever be a citizen of any state, in the sense of that term as used in the Constitution of the United States. In a sense, by shifting the issue of slavery from Congress to the settlers in the territories, Kansas, Nebraska was removing Congress from the equation. By stripping African Americans of citizenship, the Dred Scott decision removed any legal footing to advance their cause. While unwilling to embrace the idea of a slave power conspiracy, Lincoln paints a picture that brings it right up to the line. We cannot absolutely know that all these exact adaptations are the results of pre-concert, but when we see a lot of framed timbers, different portions of which we know have been gotten out at different times and places and by different workmen, Stephen, Franklin, Roger, and James, for instance, and when we see these timbers joined together and see they exactly make the frame of a house or a mill, all the tenons and mortises exactly fitting, and all the lengths and proportions of the different pieces exactly adapted to their respective places, and not a piece too many or too few, not admitting even scaffolding, or if a single piece be lacking, we can see the place in the frame exactly fitted and prepared to yet bring such a piece in. In such a case, we find it impossible not to believe that Stephen and Franklin and Roger and James all understood one another from the beginning and all worked upon a common plan or draft drawn up before the first lick was struck. Returning to the title of the address, A House Divided, we see what Lincoln wished to impress upon his audience. The slavery question had become a battle over the future character of the nation. While slavery and freedom had coexisted, often uneasily since the nation's founding, time was quickly running out on this arrangement. The single missing piece of which Lincoln spoke was that future court case which would push the South's peculiar institution into all of the states, old as well as new. Stopping this momentum was the task facing the Republican Party. If the evidence did not exactly prove a slave power conspiracy, Lincoln believed that at the very least, promoting or accepting the possibilities of slavery's expansion was a means to satisfy personal ambitions.